we're going to move really quickly and compress 6 months of work, gigabytes of data, and a 40-page report down into less than 10 minutes. So muster whatever energy you have, focus with us as best as you can, and we will try to be as efficient as we possibly can in the pages that follow. My name is Ramez Shehadi. I lead the digital practice for Booz & Company in the Middle East.
And I'm Jayant Bhargava, and I lead the digital media practice for the firm in the Middle East.
Excellent. So, within Booz, we have an ideation center, also known as a think tank, in essence. And this think tank has tackled a number of different large and many ways nebulous topics over the years, from women empowerment to children and youth to healthcare issues, and now more recently the digital advent of digital services and capabilities across different segments of society. And this last year we conducted a study on generations. Largely because no one has tackled the topic on generations, and we looked to see what this generational lens might mean in terms of efficiencies or inefficiencies in the way societies and economies are growing. So we did a survey of around 3,000 people across 11 countries. And what we found, interestingly, is that 3 generally broad categories emerged. The first we called the Arab digital generation. And in fact, this had been defined previously by a previous study we did last year in conjunction with Google that basically said there's a segment of our population, ages 15 to 35, that is dramatically influenced by mass digitization. So the availability of technologies and tools and services, and at the same time, globalization. The second generation that we were able to translate or interpret from the data, we called the Arab regional generation. And that's the segment of the population that was largely influenced by oil wealth and the dispersion of wealth and the impact of that wealth on the movement of people and economies, and the resulting formation of economic blocs. And the third category we called the Arab national generation. The Arab national generation was largely influenced by pan-Arabism. So if you think back at the turn of the last century, as the Ottoman Empire was declining, there was a mega struggle to define Arabism throughout this part of the world, and it really culminated in the late 40s and early 50s in terms of an Arab identity, in terms of culture, religion, history, and so forth. So 3 categories: ANG, Arab National Generation; RG, Arab Regional Generation; and ADG, Arab Digital Generation. And our study basically identified societal similarities and differences across these different generations and across the 11 countries. And then we took on very individualized a lens of how these different segments are operating. And what we find in terms of the similarities is that what creates the ecosystem for consensus is really the extended family. The extended family in the Arab world drives a lot of transfer of culture and behavior that really comes about in a number of categories. And these categories are around dignity, around generosity, around hospitality, and honesty. No surprise, it's part and parcel of generally who we are across generations and across geographies. We also happen to agree on what we're not happy about and what we think is inefficient in the region. So a lack of transparency, the whole concept of wasta, while it has many benefits, also creates a lot of inefficiencies in our part of the world. We have a high level of unemployment. We all agree about it. It's somewhere over 25%. We have generally poor quality of healthcare despite the import of many great leading brands from around the world. It hasn't had a step impact on the general well-being and wellness of societies in this part of the world. And the notion of censorship, which has probably been discussed quite a bit here at the Media Summit. Us in the region, like everywhere else in the world, are struggling between the right balance, or finding the right balance, between security, stability, expression, and discussion.
So what Ramez just talked about was the dynamics at the home. So let's move outside home and let's move to education and school. That's where we start seeing striking differences between the different generations. The ADGers on one side feel that the quality of education that they are receiving in their home countries does not prepare them adequately well for the evolving demands of the workflows. And they pretty much call the quality of the education poor. But if you take the same discussion and you take it to the ANG, they are quite satisfied with the level of education that they received during their times. What is going on? Globalization is really causing greater needs on the education system. I mean, the top 5 jobs that exist in the world today didn't exist 5 years back. And that puts an amazing pressure on the education curricula to move fast enough. And it's not only the curricula, the depth of the curricula, but it's also how it's told and how it's taught. So the teaching methods and how the content is presented. If you move from education now to the workplace, the differences or the divide between the generations become even more striking. ANG, from a work ethic perspective, liked punctuality, believed in willingness to teach. And if you talk to ADGers, what inspires them at the workplace is really flexibility. It's bringing innovation to the workplace. And the evolving dynamics between what is the workplace, where is the boundary between personal time and work time, what about directiveness on one side versus collaboration or a team spiritedness on the other side? Where does this equation fall, or what does it imply? It has deep implications on productivity. There are 2 things that can emanate. One is you can find a multi-generational workforce that complements each other extremely effectively, or you can have raging conflicts at the workplace between the 2 generations. If you take this and talk about unemployment, the top reason for unemployment among ADGers is that the pace of job creation is not at the same pace of job demand. SMEs and the nascency of the SMEs in the Middle East is a key factor. The biggest contributor of employment in global world is SMEs and our SMEs. And that dynamic or that paradigm hasn't transferred itself into the region in quite the same sense. And that's where media and technology and the sectors that we all work in plays an important role, because that's very amenable not only to SMEs, but more importantly, it's extremely amenable for what the ADGers want out of employment. They want creativity, they want pace, they want speed. And if you look at an example of, let's say, creating an app versus opening a physical store to sell goods, creating an app is a fast and cheap and an exciting process versus opening a store, managing the inventory, or managing the customer interface that comes along with it is a long, tiring process. So media and technology, I think, has a big role to play in the promise of employment in the region.
Okay, so very quickly we looked at how the societal lens and what drove consensus within the home. We saw what's driving a bit of divergence as we moved out of the home and into the workplace and into education. And now we want to put on a lens of more of an individualized view, particularly on topics relating to technology, advertising, media, and commerce, because at the end of the day, it is a media summit, and we need to make it relevant for all of you here in the audience. So with that in mind, the first review was on technology. And what we were really surprised by, and what we were really interested to find, was that there was no real stark difference in the uptake and usage of technology across the generations and across geographies. You'll see very quickly just that the numbers, that it is statistically insignificant as a function of age. Everyone has a very strong uptake and utilization of technology, although they are for different reasons. So the older generation are doing it for entertainment and connectivity. Younger generations are using it for work and productivity.
So just building on what Ramez just last said, I think the difference is in the relationship they have on content. Not so much the access and availability of technology, but what they use the technology for. So to give an example, the ANG today, in its debate or discussions with the public sector, are much more comfortable doing that in a face-to-face gathering, in a majlis sort of an environment. Whereas the ADGers are actively adopting the digital platforms to have the same discussions, social media in specific. So this has implications on two fronts. First implication is really on the depth and pace of integration of social media into public service broadcasting. And the other implication is really on the pace of electronic, mobile, and smart government initiatives. And case in point, I mean, the UAE government's call to action in this regard is quite timely. In terms of media consumption, right, I think social media, the way and what social media plays a role in the region is not quite different than what you see globally. The social media platform is increasingly moving from just staying connected with friends to a marketplace. But what is extremely critical to understand in this region is that everybody is participating in that marketplace. It's not only the ADGers, the ANGs are actually participating as much in that marketplace as are the ADGers. So what impact does this have in the world of advertising? In the world of advertising, I think the only key difference that we see is television versus online. So ADGers have a preference of moving from television to online, but the ANGs are not following them in that shift. But outside television and online, all other media platforms, they are walking the pace together. So if you look at mass media, for instance, you would find not much difference in the impact that mass media has on either brand awareness or a purchasing decision for any of the generations. And if you overplay that with where the marketers are spending their money, I think the bigger divide is on where the marketing dollars are being invested. You would see in the region today, a dominant or a majority part of the advertising dollars are going towards mass media, where the purchasing decisions are happening somewhere else on some other platform. And if you see social media, which continues to be a small percentage of the overall advertising spend, it doesn't take into account the growing impact of social media as a marketplace. And this causes, for advertisers, a level of inefficiency which is clearly visible. So if you take the power of digital in the ability to contextualize, in the ability to target, and I think that power of digital is being harnessed in some digitally advanced countries, but is not being harnessed to the extent it should be harnessed. And if you see the numbers over there, where 60% of the ADGers believe that the advertisement they receive is either unwanted or irrelevant, that's a big number, and the power of digital can help resolve that.
And when we translate that to the commerce equation, and we should be mindful here to note that from a commerce perspective, from an e-commerce perspective, we set the bar extremely low. We basically said, have you done even one commercial transaction online? And the average comes out even below 30%, which is desperately low in this part of the world. Now, when you compare that to the rest of the world or the developed world, in terms of an average, it's less than half. And in terms of number of transactions, I mean, the gap is really, really much, much greater. But there are reasons for this. There are ecosystem reasons for this. You know, we don't have the right financial regulations in place in terms of bankruptcy. We don't have cross-border payment systems. And the list goes on and on as to what structurally is impeding this. But from a preference perspective, the generations, the next page, the generations are revealing quite commonly that they have similarity in their behaviors in terms of trust for the information that they're finding outside of social media, online, their slow uptake in using non-cash payments, credit cards, frankly, an absence of online payments in many of the regions. And the list goes on and on. And to summarize all of these challenges, what we basically find is that the generational differences and similarities are magnifying the structural challenges that are inherent to the region. That education curricula are not providing the skills necessary for the new generations to succeed in the workforce, that the policies that prevail are not driving greater productivity across the nuances of the generations in the workforce and in the workplace, that marketers and brand managers and advertisers are not spending on promoting these brands and products in a way that is acceptable or receptive by consumers, and that e-commerce needs an ecosystem transformation in order to truly be unleashed and grow. And to kind of wrap it in a very simple statement, generations are outpacing, in terms of demand, what governments are providing by way of policies and what businesses are providing by way of services and tangible change on the ground. And so their call to action is precisely to address these 2 points. And the report, and you read it post this presentation, will highlight a portfolio of possible policies that governments can champion and a number of actions that the private enterprise can move into kinetic and tangible and measurable outcomes that will significantly impact the workplace, healthcare, education, commerce, and the like. So a few minutes over time, but I think we wrapped it pretty quickly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.